Hi, so today I'll cover Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which I recently just finished reading and annotating. And here I'll summarize some of Aristotle's arguments. And in this video, I'll add a section where I talk about what I agree with, the strengths of his argument, what I personally feel like is well justified, and some of the things I don't necessarily agree with, and what the flaws that I see in some of his arguments. So, if we remember from last time, we left off at this conclusion that Aristotle concluded, which is that happiness is exercising virtue. And now that begs the question, what is virtue, first of all, and how do we obtain virtue? That's the second question that we want to ask. Well, let's tackle the first question first. So what is virtue? What is acting morally good? What is acting in a moral way? Well, firstly, Aristotle says that virtue is a state of character. It's naturally imbued within us, and it is reflected by our actions and our thoughts and how we feel. But most importantly, it's something that's within us. It's part of our character. And the second, more interesting point that he makes is virtue is a mean between two vices. This is what he calls the golden mean. And here, we're trying to answer the question, what action is good, what action is bad? Well, this image here serves to clarify this topic, where Aristotle says that every virtue is in between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency, because he says excess and deficiency are what cause our actions to become immoral. For example, in this case, we have something like respect, where if we show too little respect, then it's disregard, it's being rude. But if we show too much respect, then it's idolatry, it's things on that spectrum. Same thing with something like courage. If we show too little courage, then we show cowardice. But if we show too much, then we show recklessness. In this case, the golden mean is situated between the excess and the deficient, both of which are categorized as vices. And this is a very interesting theory, I think, because it strays away from the dichotomous good and bad ideals of something like Christian morals, where a certain thing is good and there's only a certain opposite, which is bad, instead of there being kind of two different poles, which I think is an interesting theory. However, Aristotle has some considerations, which we'll talk about. Firstly, he says that although there are certain traits and certain virtues that are situated in between excesses and deficiencies, some of them just are absolute bad. Some of them are just plain wrong. And he likens this to things like malice and murder and jealousy and theft and shamelessness and things like this. He says it's not an excess or deficiency of them that's evil, but it's the action itself that is evil. Additionally, he says that the golden mean can be closer to one end of the spectrum than it is to the other. Take, for example, courage. When we think of courage, what do we think as the opposite of courage? Well, we wouldn't necessarily say recklessness. However, we would be more inclined to say that cowardice is the opposite of courage. So as a result, it must mean that courage can't directly lie in the center as the mean of these two, rather must be situated somewhere more along the excess. This can go for other things, but it goes to show that the mean isn't always situated in the middle, and it's not always a perfect mean. And we'll talk about the implications of this more later on. Well, now we know what Aristotle's definition of virtue is. It's a state of character, which is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. But how do we go about obtaining virtue in this case? Is it that we're just naturally born with it, or is it something that we gain via learning and experience? Well, Aristotle says, no, we're not born with it. Why? Because he says that nothing that is naturally imbued within us can be changed to depart from our instincts. Basically saying that if it's an innate behavior of ours, then it wouldn't be able to be modified and it wouldn't be able to be changed. However, we know that morals and virtues is something that can be imbued and instilled within us by our parents, by society, by others like that. He compares it to a rock falling down. He says that since a stone naturally falls down, and that's part of the nature of the stone to do that, it can't be habituated to fall upwards, to randomly start flying. And personally, I don't necessarily like this argument too much because I feel like it's a very physical way to prove the statement, and I don't think it holds up too well. Personally, I would agree that yes, no, we're not born with it. But the reason why it differs, I feel like for us, it's not that we're born with virtues or we're born with morals or not. Rather, we're born with simply innate behaviors. And then these behaviors are then classified as moral or not moral based off the moral code that we live in. So by asking the question, are we born with virtue or not, makes the fundamental assumption that there's a set list of virtues that are what is considered moral throughout the world, rather than thinking of it as we're born all with the same behavior. It's just certain ones are deemed moral and certain are deemed immoral. I think this is a fundamental thing that's routinely assumed within and makes the basis of Aristotle's argument of that there are certain things that are uniquely moral and uniquely immoral. For example, things like courage and respect, and these things are moral no matter where you are in the universe, and things like malice and murder and selfishness are universal evils. But continuing on with his explanation, he says that virtue is something that we can acquire. It's something that's flexible to change, which I agree with. It's something that we can learn and something that can be shaped by our society. But then in this case, is it learned via theory or is it learned via practice? And Aristotle says it's not learned via theory because if we learn it by theory, it's sort of like listening carefully to a doctor but carrying out none of his instructions, which is what he says. And he says by doing, anything that we have to learn to do, we learn by the actual doing of it. So what he's saying that doing virtuous actions helps us learn to be virtuous. It allows us to be virtuous. However, he also says that by gaining virtue, then we're also able to do virtuous actions. And by doing virtuous actions, we're able to become virtuous. For example, if we're brave, we're able to do brave actions. And if we do brave actions, then that means we're a brave person. And this ends up being a positive feedback loop of doing virtuous things and becoming virtuous. In other words, Aristotle is saying that to obtain virtue, we must do virtuous things. Because by doing virtuous things, by that virtue, we'll be able to be assigned the label of being brave or courageous or respectful and things like that. So Aristotle lists out, he lists out a framework as to how we can reach virtuosity, how we can reach moral goodness, and how we can do the right thing. Well, first thing he says is that actions dictate character, which is something important to know. He says that your actions dictate who you are, and also your character dictates your actions. So because it's a feedback loop, if you do virtuous things, you will be virtuous. And if you're virtuous, you'll do virtuous things. And the fundamental part of his argument is in doing. He says it's not merely enough to know how to do the right thing, because if you know how to do the right thing and you don't actually do it, then you're not being virtuous. You're just someone that has the potential to become virtuous. But if you're doing those actions, that will directly translate you into being assigned the label of someone that's moral, someone that's virtuous. Secondly, he says, keep away from the extreme most contrary to the mean. So if we go back to his theory of the golden mean, since we know that certain means are closer to certain extremes than others, he says, stay away from the one most opposite, because that must be the lesser of both evils if this one is skewed in this direction. The third thing he says is locate extremes we approach and move in the opposite direction. And this is pretty straightforward. He's basically saying, if we catch ourselves straying towards one end of the spectrum, in this case, if we look at respect, if we see ourselves straying too far towards one end, that we need to keep ourselves in check and move back in the opposite direction. Because if we move in the opposite direction from where the extreme is, then we'll start to move back towards the mean, and we'll be on our way to virtuosity. And lastly, he says that be wary of what you want to do and what you ought to do. Essentially, he's saying that we have to be careful of what feels good and sticking to comfort, because that eventually leads us to sticking to our habits. If we're someone that, by our previous habits, is someone that is, for example, lazy or someone that's selfish, that will feel good to us because those are our habits. That's what is comfortable for us. And he says, be aware and be cautious of that feeling of comfort, because sometimes comfort impedes real progress. He says sometimes to enable, in order to reach that mean, in order to reach the golden mean, it's important that we exit our comfort zone and we do the things that we know that we need to do internally, rather than the things that we've always been doing and what feels good to do. Ultimately, through all of this, Aristotle says that seeking virtuosity isn't really an easy task. It's very difficult. Hitting the mean is often very difficult, but we can try to get as close to the mean as possible, and that's how we can become virtuous. So now that we've kind of concluded his argument of what is virtue, well, virtue is a mean between two vices, and it's an internal state of character. And how do we obtain it? By acting virtuously, because that in turn changes who we are. That changes our character. I want to express some of the points that I personally agree with and some of the points that I feel like are of criticism and I don't necessarily agree with. So, firstly, what I agree with is that what's right or wrong lies on a spectrum, and it's not a dichotomous yes or no. So what I mean by this is I find the idea of a spectrum of bad and good lying somewhere within to be an intriguing idea, because it shows us that it's not as black or white as what we think of in common morality, which is something is good and something else is evil. For example, if we're respectful, then that's good. And if we're rude, then that's evil. So by having kind of a spectrum, it allows for more flexibility and a greater level of a greater range of what can be considered good and what can be considered bad. And this ties into my next point, which is there's such thing as an excess of virtue. In the morality that we've commonly been taught, something like respect. The more respect you show, the better. There's never a limit as to when it becomes excessive, because respect is just good in itself. We should strive for as much respect as possible. However, in Aristotle's view, if we show too much respect, that might also be a bad thing, because, like he says over here, it can lead us into idolatry, which is something that we should not be attaining for. So I feel like both of these ideas combined, it provides a overview of morality which deviates from the common and the well-known right or wrong morality, suggesting that what's right isn't necessarily 100% right, and you can act virtuous in an excessive way, and that can end up being bad. Thirdly, I agree that our character is malleable. A lot of people say that so like whatever or a certain trait of them, that's just how they are and they can't really change that. But I don't necessarily agree. I feel like because of our actions influencing our character is very changeable, and we can use that for the better or for the worse, because ultimately people change, and the things that we do change our outlook on life and change how we think about things. And I feel like this is a point that I would personally agree with. Well, what do I disagree with? Well, there's really only one thing I disagree with, and even though it's only one thing, it is a very big thing. Well, Aristotle, his entire argument comes from the assumption and the premise that morality as a construct is dogmatic. Essentially, what this means is that there are universal goods and bads. It assumes that no matter the society, no matter where in the world you're talking about, no matter any other factor, there are things in the world that are certain 100% goods and some things that are 100% bads. And essentially, these things are things that he places here. However, I feel like that this is too rigid and it doesn't account for differences in morality that might exist in different societies, because ultimately morality is a social construct. It's something that's created by it's an unwritten rule of society that dictates what actions are considered good and what actions are considered bad. And by ignoring that aspect and saying that in a certain way, these goods and bads are fundamental laws of the universe, in a sense, takes away from the study of morality in the first place, because I feel like it should be more open to individualistic interpretation of what people consider good and what someone considered bad. Because if we take a person, they have their own life experiences, they have their own worldview and their own outlook on life. And as a result, different things that are considered good might be considered bad to them, and things that are considered bad might be considered good to them. And we can't go and assert that, no, you're wrong. This is what you think is bad is actually good. You're wrong. And I feel like, in a sense, this book kind of acts as this bringer of justice, in a sense of asserting that you're wrong. And because the layout of the book is kind of talking about, well, for the rest of the book, we're looking at things like courage, and it tells you what is courage, and justice, what is respect, things like this. And I feel like, to a certain extent, sure, it is valuable in understanding the perspective of what Aristotle believes, but at the end of the day, it is merely just his perspective on what these things are. It's not necessarily a universal law that in order to be courageous, you must do the 3 things I tell you to do. In order to be righteous, you must do these 3 things. I feel like it's all the time it's shaped by the worldview of the individual that reads it. And although it gives us some good general guidelines to follow the morality that is most commonplace within society, I feel like at a certain point, it's also important to consider the individual expression and considerations of critical thinking and how other people might think about morality as a whole. Because it's not just one set of moral values that reign supreme, but it all varies upon the person and their life experience, like I said. So ultimately, I feel like this is one of my main concerns with Aristotle's argument and his argumentation as a whole, is that certain things are categorized as absolute goods, and he basically just tells you how to achieve those goods based on his own philosophy and his own opinion. And I feel like it removes the relativism that's involved in morality. And I know this is a point that many modernist philosophers, for example Nietzsche, have criticized. And although I feel like it'll be valuable to continue reading and seeing what these perspectives are. I feel like it is a bit assertive at its core, and that's something that I feel like is not necessarily the reflective of the individual nature of morality and philosophy as a whole. But in general, I feel like his theory is still really interesting, and I agree with a lot of things he said, while also maintaining a personal level of skepticism. And yeah, so next time I'll be looking at the third book and seeing what he says there.